It was the meeting houses of New England that defined and molded life in Puritan towns throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And though meeting houses were one of the last structures to be built in newly developed towns, meeting houses were the center of the community. Their doors provided the community bulletin board where important announcements, such as those calling a meeting house, could be placed. And in areas infested by wolves, hunters claiming the bounty for their kills were required to nail the heads of the wolves to the meeting house doors as proof. In times of war, the meeting houses of New England were places of shelter and defense, where the townsfolk could refuge during an attack. And in many towns, town ammunition was stored in the meeting houses as well. Town government today is even based off of the format of the 17th century town meetings, in that meeting houses are an open floor to the debate and discussion of important issues. They are the meeting houses that reflect the history of New England from tiny colonial villages to the bustling towns we see today. In 1650, the area in New England known as New Meadows acquired enough settlers to officially be declared the town of Topsfield. 8 years later, in 1658, the first meeting house was built, and though its location and appearance is not known, historians believe that it stood on the intersection of Howlett Street and Meeting House Lane, hence the name of the street. The first meeting house only stood for 5 years before it was replaced by the second meeting house in 1663. Instead of adhering to the ordering of towns, as noted in John Winthrop's Essay on the Ordering of Towns, which dated around 1635, the second meeting house was not located in the center of Topsfield, but was instead relocated in what is now Pine Grove Cemetery.
Now, when the second meeting house was going to be built in Topsfield, now the people who were living in what was called Rowley Village, which we now call Boxford, wanted to participate. They didn't have enough people and enough money to be able to have their own minister at the time. So they wanted to share with Topsfield. But to get from Rowley Village all the way to Meeting House Lane in Topsfield was really a hardship because, again, the roads, there weren't really roads. There were just tracks through the woods and over the fields. So Topsfield agreed, the Topsfield congregation agreed to share their minister and agreed to move the meeting house closer. And that's how it ended up in what is now Pine Grove Cemetery.
In 1675, the second meeting house was fortified with a 6-foot-tall wall that was 3 feet thick, along with a watch house on the southeast side during King Philip's War, so that in the event of an attack, the villagers could seek shelter in the meeting house. The third meeting house was built in 1703 under Reverend Joseph Capon, whose yearly salary was £65, 20 of which was paid in silver, and the other 45 was paid in pork and beef. The third meeting house was moved to its present location on the Topsfield Common and was roughly 40 feet wide and 44 feet long, and the workers had to level a small hill to build it. Though there is no photographic record of the first 3 meeting houses besides the drawings on the early maps of Topsfield, the meeting houses in that era were simple square post and beam structures like the one depicted in the mural by William Kellogg in the Topsfield Town Library atrium. Construction on the fourth meeting house started in 1759 and finished in 1760, and was the last meeting house to be built by the taxes and labor of the townsfolk. Built at 54 feet in length, 42 feet in width, and crowned by a steeple with a weather vane of a rooster on top, the fourth meeting house was one of the first to break out of the simple box-like structures of the meeting houses before it. The building of the meeting house was a huge town event, and on completion was celebrated with a barrel of rum, a 12 cider, and dinner for 100 men.
The fourth meeting house in Topsfield is one that was raised with a great deal of celebration and excitement by the community. They needed a bigger structure because they had more parishioners. These celebrations were really raucous and riotous. The name of the ridge pole at the very top of a meeting house, and that's the pole that's the very top of the roof. Another name for it is the rum pole, because once they got up on the top, the bottles of rum would be passed up to the workmen who were up there on, finishing off and capping the post and beam structure, the timber frame structure. From other descriptions, we know that there would be great feats of athletic agility where the men who were up on the top would leap from beam to get down to the ground. And so there were all of these issues of, who was quickest, who was fastest. There were races to the bottom. And then the entire community would sit on the foundation. They would sit all around the foundation of the newly erected building that didn't yet have its walls and roof and everything. It was just the structure. And there they would have their food and their cider and their rum and have a big party at the end of this whole thing.
It was the fourth meeting house in the town of Topsfield that voted to form a militia and support the Declaration of Independence. During the American Revolution, the militia could be seen practicing maneuvers on the common in front of the meeting house in preparation for battle.
But when the meeting house was used as a place of assembly for the community, everyone had the right to speak. In fact, one of the other terms for meeting house is mouth house. That is, people were able to literally mouth off and speak their minds. The most famous one, of course, is the Old South Church in Boston that, has quite a history of that sort of thing. Well, what this means, of course, is that as the colonists of the Mass Bay colony were contemplating the revolution and participation in the revolution, they all gathered in their meeting houses, and that's where they spoke out about their grievances about the king or taxation or whatever it is, their dreams of a free country and the like, and that this is where all of this discussion about revolution was actually taking place. And so the British knew that, and here we had meeting houses in every community where everyone was talking about revolution. And so the British came to understand that these were the hotbeds of sedition, and that this is where literally the American Revolution was launched, in the exchange of ideas in the meeting houses.
In 1817, the steeple was removed from the fourth meeting house, and a capped tower was erected in its place that would hold the Paul Revere Bell. The Paul Revere Bell was purchased in 1817 from Paul Revere and Son in Boston for $400 and weighed 938.5 pounds. Upon being installed in the meeting house, it was decreed that the bell be rung on all Sabbath day, and it would toll the funeral as well. The Paul Revere Bell can be seen on the most current meeting house today, and it is still in its original cradle. The fifth meeting house was built in 1842 after the fourth meeting house was sold and moved to Salem for use as a tannery. After the separation of church and state in 1823, the fifth meeting house was retained by the Congregational Church of Topsfield and was the first Topsfield meeting house to be built by church finances. Mark Jewett, who had also built the meeting houses in Hamilton, Rowley, and West Newbury, was hired for the job, and his signature can still be seen on a beam in the meeting house today. As Dr. Martha Morrison sums up, the story of the meeting house of the Congregational Church of Topsfield is not unlike that of other meeting houses throughout New England. Through its growth and development, Topsfield's place in the wider world can be traced.